Hi, this is Roger. Thanks for dropping by. Sunday morning chat, random subjects. um, Basically, I'd like to have a chat about how do we tell if we've had a good year with our orchids, I mean. I don't mean financially or whatever. But it is difficult, but I was talking to quite a few other orchid growers at the Wessex Orchid Society yesterday about assessing what to some was a difficult year because of the heat wave and the dry spell. A lot of people ran out of rainwater, had a mad panic for information on the RO unit I've got. But yeah, I mean, there are troubled times with growing orchids any time of year. You know, you can get a bug infestation, you can get the various bacterial infections and things like that. But moving those to one side, just generally speaking, how do you assess your year? Well, first of all, if you've acquired plants during the growing year, it's not going to be easy to tell. You've got no history with the plant, you've got no record. I mean, you can compare your plant with people who've got the same plant if you can get to them, like at orchid societies or on YouTube videos. But it is often difficult to tell. I mean, I was discussing the introduction for me for the first time using the CalMag. And that hasn't been done before, and it's still difficult to tell whether it actually did any good or not. Overall, I can reasonably safely say, yes, it did. With plants that I've had a while, I can compare. I mean, let's just that dendrobium, for example, even though it's tangled up with that one, but you can tell the difference, the size of the canes. This is Friedrichianum. Now, last year's canes are down here. They were, for me, a good size, better than the previous year. So I've got a good 3-year history here. So this plant I can look at. Now, previous year's canes are still in leaf. They will probably start to lose those leaves during this winter period, and then they'll become deciduous canes. Now, if you go back here to these little diddy canes, those were the ones that were on it when I first got the plant. So when these grew last year, I was impressed. And I was even more impressed this spring that it actually bloomed. First time, quite honestly. I think it had one spike the year before with 2 blooms on. That's not what I call a blooming, that's a miserable effort. But I was pleased. But now look, this is this year's growth up here. A lot of it, a flipping good root system's developed this year up in here. And this needs a winter rest, this one. Unfortunately, it's decided at the moment to still be growing. I've still got some growth on a couple of the canes. So although I'm slowing it down, I'm not resting this one yet, as opposed to some others that I am. Because they've stopped growing, so that they're in that position. So that's a good way to tell. But I can only tell that on this plant because I've got a history with it. I've had it at least 3 years, maybe even 4. I mean, it was a very small young plant when I got it. Nonetheless, when I got it, I was pleased with it. And I get more and more pleased as time goes on. So I can quite safely say that this plant has done better this year than it ever has. The canes are longer, stronger, better leaf colour, and a much better root system to support that extra growth. Because don't forget, at the moment, this plant's not only still growing these large canes up the top, it's also maintaining the leaves on last year's canes. So this has had to work hard this year, and it had to work hard in adverse conditions, you know, with the long, dry, hot spell. Now, although it wasn't a dry spell in here, thanks to gargantuan efforts on my part, trying to literally keep up with the watering because of the heat. And it wasn't just the daytime heat, it was the fact that the temperature didn't drop down at night. So it was constantly warm out here. So, that was my difficult year, was simply the continuous heat day in, day out, which was difficult to keep up with. But that plant's a good example of done a lot better this year than last year and previous years. So we can go okay with that one. Another dendrobium over here, I would say this one's done particularly well this year. You know, I mean, if you look at the size of some of the older bulbs, these would have probably been the bulbs that were on it when I got the plant. So a relatively young plant. Now, strictly speaking, some of these canes down here are actually kikis. But nonetheless, the roots are close enough in to be able to get to the mount so they can stay as part of the plant. This is in fact a kiki, believe it or not. But it's in with the other canes. Now this one's grown well again this year. And then you go into panic mode. Oh, no, what's wrong with that leaf? There's nothing wrong with that leaf. All that happened on that cane was when it was back here where my finger is, and this was a shiny little new leaf like this one, it got some mealybugs on it. And they bit lumps out of it, and they've marked the leaf. If there was a serious problem with that plant, that wouldn't be the only leaf. But it is. So, worry not. My cattleyas this year. I mean, this is a classic example. I haven't had this cattleya a long time, but talking to the guy who owned this, he only ever got 3 blooms per spike, and he never got a spike that was a foot long. So I'd class that as a major improvement on this plant. But the real improvement on this plant is behind that leaf is its second new growth that's going to bloom. So that put up 2 stronger new growths than ever before. Yeah? And both are going to bloom. So although I haven't had this plant a really long time, I've had it long enough to get a double progression on it. This was the first cane I grew and it bloomed. Now I've put out 2. They're slightly shorter, but they're fatter, and they've put up more blooms than this plant is used to doing. So I'd class that as progress. There's another large cattleya behind that one that put up a new growth in both directions. Both have massive sheaths on them. They will bloom. But it can be difficult to tell. I mean, if you just take this little Miltonia here, the progression on this one is you've got the older part of the plant, those 2 bulbs on the left, and then immediately in front of them was a new growth at the time. Well, that was when it was recovering from fusarium, so I was pleased with that growth. Nice big bulb. Leaves are still on it as well. But then it went out in 2 directions and put up 2 new bulbs, both with good leaves, both bloomed. Well, now it's putting up 2 new growths on that lead, and although you can't see it, there's 2 new growths on that lead. There is a little tiny growth behind that sheath. Yeah? So that's gone from 1 new growth to 2 to 4. I'd say the plant's improving dramatically. And next year I should have a choice of 4 new growths to bloom from. If they all bloom, brilliant. So there, you know, some plants that you've got a history with, you can tell, and others are just not very difficult. Because I watered everything, what's today, Friday, my 3 Phalaenopsis type dendrobiums at the back there, that's that one, the taller one, and the one on the left. I'm not getting them out, but they've grown this year better than they have ever done. And I've had some of those plants 4 years, and they've never done that well. This year, multiple new growths, good fat bulbs, canes, and looking at those when I watered them, all of those new growths have a nubbin at the apex. So I would suggest that later down the line, they're all going to bloom. Well, one of them didn't bloom at all last year. One of them had the white one had a really pathetic spike, and all the buds blasted except for 1 bloom. Now that bloom lasted ages, but a single white bloom on that type of plant is very, very poor. The much taller one in the middle, that's a named one, that's Thai Angel, and that did have 1 reasonable spike on it that lasted well through the winter. So, you know, they're coming on. I can safely say that this bunch of Latorias down here have not done very well. Now, this is in fact an antelope type. Serious problem with that one. Serious issue with the leaves. Very, very patchy. Quite badly damaged. I mean, this was last year's growth, dumped its leaves. And strictly speaking, this shouldn't be annually deciduous. This new growth's lost nearly all its leaves except for the top two. They didn't bloom. And this year's new growth's not quite as tall, but at least now these leaves are hanging in there. This one over here, this one's not doing too bad. It does actually have a spike. I forget what that is. That is a cross. No, it's not. It's Alexandrae, so it's a species. So that one hasn't done too bad. And if you look at the progression, each cane is getting bigger, and the latest cane is not the one that's blooming. It's the previous one down there. That little one over there lost loads of leaves, and all I can put this down to is the heat. Or potentially, with that heat, just not keeping them hydrated enough. The Latoria types, although they have a drier winter, that's normally purely because the temperatures are lower, so they're not growing as much. But they do come from a wet, dry, seasonal variation rather than spring, summer, autumn, winter like we get here. So they do have a dry season. So those haven't done so well. Quite a lot of my Oncidiums now. I mean, I've got what I call my rubbish set down on the floor down here. These are all recovering plants, but they are recovering. But they're going to take a while. You know, they got down to like 1 or 2 leafless bulbs and struggled to put up a new growth, but they're trying. It's the only reason they're still here, quite honestly. You know, so some things are slow. But they're coming on. I mean, my Nellie Isla didn't die despite serious damage. I mean, that pseudo bulb practically got eaten. That was when I was messing about trying to get rid of scale, and the scale broke the surface of the bulb and rot set in. So I'm lucky that survived, very lucky. But it's put out a new growth that's not very good, which the silly thing's trying to spike. That spike's going to have to come off. I need to get some strength back into that plant. But at least it didn't die. It's not doing very well, is it? This Dendrobium delicatum is not doing as well as it ought. In my mind, it's not doing as well as it ought to be. It was a single kiki when I got it, for next to no money at all, and I got this for the fragrance, not the blooms themselves, but it's highly fragrant, this one. It can fill a room if it ever blooms. And that year that I got the kiki, which would have been a February show, so at the beginning of the year it grew a new cane, and this year it's grown another cane. Well, this year I was expecting 2. You know, I was expecting some progression. So far I've got effectively a 2-year-old plant from a kiki that's still only got 3 canes. So not doing so good. Should be doing better. It hasn't got a very good root system, that one. What else can we have a look at for... I mean, this little Latoria, this is Rhodostictum. Now, this to me is a poor plant. But then you sort of have to... I haven't got one to compare it with. I don't know anybody else that's got one, that's had it long enough to see a progression. But it keeps growing a single new growth. This is its latest new growth. Larger than anything before. Yeah, and it's going to have 4 blooms. Well, the first year it ever bloomed, it only had 1. Then it had 2. Well, we got 4 now. These are quite large blooms. And on an older cane... that's virtually leafless, because that leaf's going to drop, it's pushed a second spike out with a couple of buds. So although it doesn't look good, it is doing better than it has done. So that's all I can say with that one. It's doing better, but it's not doing good. You know, so you just have to sort of have a look round. I mean, my zygos are still alive, and that's how I measure those. Are you still with us, or have you gone to the hedge? They are still with us. They have produced new growths. They are currently producing more growths, and one of them has got a spike. So that's progression. I'm doing better with those than I have in the past, because I used to just kill the flipping things. Can't class that as a success, not in anybody's book. This is Epidendrum nocturnum. And you can see the progression on this one. Little tiny cane, that's what it had when I got it. Then it grew this one, and I was over the moon because it produced a spike. Yeah? And then that spike bloomed, and the bloom self-pollinated. And I was annoyed. That's putting it mildly. It then grew this cane, much larger than anything before. And this one is going to bloom very soon. The bloom's getting to the bud's getting to its full length now, and this is a good thing. You know, if you're relatively new to orchids, when you get a bud, you can tell how big your flower's going to be by the length of the bud, because what you're looking at there is 3 sepals. Well, when that opens, these are 2.5 inches long. Well, there's 3 of them. They're going to spread out in different directions, so that's going to be nearly 5 inches across in some shape or form, and that's before we look at the petals and the lip. That spike's also branching. So I'd say that one's grown on very well this year. My Tolumnias, they're all growing well. Oh, on the Tolumnia front, we're about to get an influx of Tolumnias. A good friend at the Wessex Orchid Society bought like a job lot, loads of them, and they don't want all of them, and asked if I would want some more. Well, given that once upon a time I had 15 and now I've only got 7, yes, I would like some more. But I'll have to be a bit selective on the grounds that there's a couple up there that were virtually lost. They nearly got thrown out, but they've recovered okay. But in the muddle of unmounting them all and cleaning all the scale off and trying to get them to grow, some of them lost their tags in the muddle out in the kitchen. So I've got all the names in my notes, but I don't know which one's which. And until they bloom, I won't know. But all of the ones that I should be getting are named, and hopefully they'll have some pictures with them. So we should get some more Tolumnias in the... I don't know when I'm going to get them. Might even be next year. The lady in question is going to be missing a few events in the, due to other commitments and things. So I might not see her for a while. But I've said I'll take some Tolumnias. They don't take up a lot of room. You can get an awful lot of them in a very small space, quite honestly. And even though some of mine are on quite large mounts, they don't need to be. They could go on smaller mounts than that. But you can see that they do use those mounts. You're probably looking at a silhouette, aren't you? I've just thought about that. I'll brighten it up when I edit the video. This is a good one to look at, because this was in a real sorry state when it came out of the big box. Now, it's got no tag on it, but I know what it is. It's actually a hybrid called Cunico, and it's a cross with Goldschmidtianum, I think, and Victoria Regina, or Reginae, however you're going to say it. It's going to bloom, and it had some pretty desiccated looking, almost dead canes, but then it's a deciduous dendrobium, so I didn't panic, but I just thought it was doing rather poorly. And with a set of leaves like that, which was all I had to go by, it looked like it got cold damage in transport. But then if that's got Victoria Regina in it, it's got an element of cool growing in amongst it, so it did survive. It's produced a good root system this year, and a shed load of new growth. So major improvement on that plant, from looking almost dead to now being a strong, healthy plant. This one's still growing, but this is not a winter rester. So I'd expect that to carry on growing as long as I keep feeding and watering it. So sometimes it's not so easy. Oh, here's a classic one, right in my face here. This is my Rhynchorides Bangkok Sunset. This is in the why won't you bloom category. Now this had virtually no roots. Well, it has grown some roots this year, so that's progress. But there are no active growing tips on any of those roots. So although it's put out more roots so it can hydrate better, they're not growing at the moment. But this has put on quite a few new leaves this year. And don't worry about the spots. That is about right for that plant, because you can overcook this one and put it in too much light thinking it's a Vandaceous type, which it is. But you put that in the same sort of light as your normal Vandas, you'll probably burn it. This just likes that little bit less. But if you just get those little bits of purple dots and perhaps a little tinge around the edge of the leaves, it's about as much as it can take. Much more than that, it could burn. But it still hasn't bloomed. Now at the moment, that's living up in the roof, because I'm going along the lines of perhaps, because I did burn a couple of leaves on this one, perhaps I reduced the light too much. So it's now back up in the roof at this time of year. Obviously it's not getting any fierce sun in through the roof, because in the summer the sun comes straight in through the roof. This time of year it's over there. So although it's higher in much brighter light, it's still not getting any direct sun, and it never will, that one, not even winter sun. But it's getting more light now to see if that'll trigger a bloom. But it's growing much better this year than it ever has. I haven't had it a huge amount of time. We can't really look at my Nobelies because they all got hacked. I mean, my giant prima donna that got best in show earlier this year wouldn't get best of anything at the moment because it got split and I gave away the largest part. So I'm now having to bring that one on. But its new canes are growing nicely and a good number. So next spring it will bloom. The year after it will be back to its giant self again. So some progress there. Yeah, so it is difficult. I mean, there are some pretty giant oncidiums in amongst the collection. That's actually Miltonia Sunset there with all those bulbs and leaves at the top. That bloomed its head off earlier in the year. It should now be starting to produce its new growths ready for next season. It's not got an annual season, that Miltonia. It's about a 10 to 11 month cycle. So it could start blooming earlier next year because it's, as I said, it's not annual. That monster up the back is Dendrobium chrysotoxum. Now that got split. The older part of the plant died. Well, didn't show any life basically, and I'm fed up with a pot full of dead canes basically, or lifeless canes shall we say. So I've kept the good bit, and most of what you see is what I got. I mean, I haven't had this plant a year yet, but it's grown 3 new growths to go with those canes, which after a repot and some major root disturbance is not bad going. So that's coming on nicely, I would say. Yeah, so generally speaking, I would say I've had a better year, despite adverse conditions. I've tried some new types. I mean, I've got some Draculas now, and both of these Draculas are in spike as new plants. I'm happy with that. Although I don't take much notice of my Paphiopedilums at the back, and there aren't many, there's 2 little miniatures and 1, 2, 3, 4 more mature plants. 2 of those have got buds, just showing, just right down inside the crown. But it's quite easy to tell once you've seen a Paphiopedilum bud on your plant for the first time. You'll know forevermore that it's not a leaf, it's a bud. You can just tell, even though it's only a tiny little thing down in the crown. But you need to see one. You need to see that difference, and then it'll just click and you'll be fine forevermore. It takes the guesswork away. But sometimes you do have to see things for real to tell. Yeah, so I'd say it's not been a bad year. I can't definitively say that introducing the CalMag into the feeding regime has made the difference, but it probably has. I've got stronger growths in a lot of places than I've ever had before on plants that I've owned quite a long time that haven't had a major disturbance. Yeah, so I'd say the introduction of that has been a benefit. And quite honestly, it didn't exactly increase my workload. It was just a case of every now and again. When I first started, I was excuse me, mixing it in with my fertiliser, which bumped up the calcium but it also bumped up the magnesium. And I did quite a lot of reading on that, and I'm not so sure that was such a good idea. Calcium, yes, you can bump that right up, and I don't think it would ever do any harm, providing it's the right sort of calcium that the plants can absorb. They need it, you know, at the end of the day it's needed. There's a good amount in my, you know, my MSU fertiliser. It's in there in a good proportion, higher than a lot of other fertilisers, so it's in there. So plants that are average growers, I'd say there's enough. But for the stronger growers and the things chucking out stonking new growth sort of thing, a little bit of help can only be a bonus. But you can go over the top with magnesium, doing some reading on that. An excess of magnesium as a percentage relative to some of the other ingredients can have an adverse effect on those other ingredients and can actually stop them working as well as perhaps they should. So the CalMag is a combination, so I stopped mixing it in and used it as a separate entity, so that at the point that stuff was being used, it wasn't being added to, it was coming in as a single pair of entities basically. And it seems to have generally worked, so I'm not stopping, that will continue. But as far as during the winter is concerned, I've now got lights. I haven't had lights before. So that means that some things that would have slowed down almost to a stop because of the ridiculous short days. I mean, we're heading towards a 9-hour day now, we're not far off. And it's not going to be long before we're down to 8 hours. Well, it should be at least 11 for these plants. That's their natural environment in the tropics, 11 to 13 hours. They're long days, growing season, northern hemisphere anyway. They would get 13 hours and, you know, the Earth's at a tilt, basically. I don't need to go into a lot of detail. But then during the drier season, the non-monsoon season, the sun would be slightly lower and take them down to about 11 hours, but not 8. But I won't get that this year. So this is another new thing. So during this winter, because they're going to get their day lengths extended, they're going to grow a bit better than they ever have before during the winter. At least I'm hoping they do. Otherwise I'm wasting my electricity. No, I'm sure that's going to work. But nonetheless, that will affect how I think of my plants in the winter, because under normal circumstances I think of them as slowing right down virtually to a stop. You've got much lower temperatures and really short days. So there's not going to be a lot of growth. Well, this year the day length will be there. But I've still got the lower temperatures, so I can't go mad with the watering and feeding just because the day length's been extended. But I will have to think about my watering, because I will need a bit more than in previous winters, because things are going to be growing that little bit more. They're not going to go mad under the lights. They're not going to be at their full growth rate like they are in the growing season, but they're not going to slow down as much. So I need to keep my eye on my watering. And if they're going to be doing a bit more growing than previous winters, I'll have to watch me feeding as well. Rather than reducing that down to next to nothing because nothing's growing, I'll have to keep that ticking over as well. So yeah, things change, whether you like it or not. My hibiki, I have seen quite a few of these in shows, many of which have been given an award. First in class and things like that. And quite honestly, none of them were as good as this one was when it was in full bloom. Now, in some cases, I wouldn't have been able to put mine in a show because I haven't had it long enough. Certainly with Bournemouth Orchid Society, you have to have owned the plant a year. Yeah, well, I haven't. So, but nonetheless, that had a fantastic blooming. And I need to, these flowers die back, but the spikes hang on there. And normally, if you look at old bloom spikes like that, you think, oh, they'll just brush off. No, they flipping won't. Boy, do they hang on there. If I want to take those off, I'm going to have to get scissors out. So at the moment, I'm just leaving them, because obviously any cuts could possibly produce a bit of rot. So they're not doing any harm. But it bloomed well, and now it's going mad with new growths. That's the most advanced up the top there. Nice big fat cane, that one. Not as long as some of the other canes, but it looks like it will be because it's still growing. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 other growths that I can see on top of that one. So there's 5 new growths on a plant that has 2, 4, 6, 7 canes. So 5 new growths on top of a 7 cane plant. It's not far off doubling its size, is it? So all I've got to do is make sure that flipping blooms again next year, because that can bloom on the same canes that have already bloomed. Plus there's some of those older canes that haven't bloomed yet. They should bloom. And I haven't had it long enough, but I might even get some blooms on the new growths next year. So that could be something a bit special next year, although it was very special this year. And the real bonus, quite honestly, is the depth and intensity of the colour with Hibiki. But boy, do those blooms last an age. Absolute age. So that one cost me not a lot of money and has already earned its keep. Yeah, certainly a real bonus there. So, generally speaking, I think things have done good. I mean, a little Arengus like this. This is difficult to say whether it's doing any better than ever has. I mean, it started off with one bloom, with one spike with 2 blooms on. Last year it had 2 spikes with a couple of blooms on each, and this year it's got 2 spikes. It's alive, it's grown some new leaves, it's pushed out some new roots, and it's going to bloom. But all I can say really with that one is it's doing as well as it ever has. I can't say it's doing any better, but these are incredibly slow growers. You know, that's Arengus blah blah blah, fastuosa, brain dead. But it's doing okay. It's doing as well as it ever has done. So yeah, it's doing okay. And I got a feeling this was one of the big box orchids that I knew nothing about and still know very little about. This is a tetragonum. All I know is that if this ever blooms, the blooms are going to be unusual. I'm going to leave it at that. Look it up if you want to see what they're like. But that latest new growth up the top there's looking pretty good. And guess what? It's going to spike. Or it has a spike. It's going to bloom. So we will see those blooms. I don't know how long it's going to take, but it's on its way. So, you know, coming from what looked like a very young plant, I'm sure it was, because there's lots of different sized bulbs on here. There are seedling canes on this dendrobium, but you know, it's grown a couple of reasonable new canes, and then this one, so bigger and better, and it looks like we're going to get some bloom. So I'd say that one's coming on nicely, but I haven't got a history with it. I haven't had it long enough. You know, the big box arrived in what was called the Beast from the East early this year, when everybody froze their whatnots off for weeks at a time, and people had quite a lot of snow that they hadn't seen before. So yeah, so hard conditions this year. If you start the year from the 1st of January, an incredibly cold winter, right into March, and then not long after that, a heat wave where crystal clear skies, brilliant sunshine for a huge long period. So I wouldn't say I've had the best growing year as far as my weather was concerned and my conditions, but my plants seem to have done okay. So I'm putting it down as a pretty good year, and hopefully some of that is to do with the addition of the CalMag. There's bound to have been an effect of some sort, and it, you know, as long as you don't go mad with that stuff, it can only be positive. But next year I might look into getting a product that is just the calcium and remove the magnesium out of it. As I said, my feed's got a reasonable amount of magnesium in there, and that's not a high requirement, the magnesium. The calcium is, yes, but not so much. And obviously if you try and increase your calcium intake by dosing it up with CalMag, you're whacking up the magnesium at the same time because they can't be separated. So anyway, sort of general view of the year. A lot of people have struggled. A lot of growers have had plants stall on them. I didn't hear of anybody who'd lost a lot of plants. I suppose from one point of view we're lucky in the UK, unless you've got some native terrestrials or anything like that. Nearly everybody's growing either in the home or in some sort of controlled environment, like a conservatory like mine or a greenhouse. But trying to keep a greenhouse cool in the sort of weather we had this year was almost impossible. So quite a lot of people have got greenhouses with cool growers in. They didn't stay cool this year, not unless they had some sort of real cooling unit, air conditioning unit or something. So anyway, that's my Sunday morning chat, just random stuff, and trying to judge whether a plant's done better this year than it has in previous years. Well, the only way you can do that is if you've had it long enough to do that. If this is its first year, all you can do is say it's still alive, it's growing, and it's got some roots. And bottom line with orchids, look after what's in the pot or the mount, and the plant will look after itself. Quite honestly, a plant with a good root system will grow. You're going to have to get your conditions way off to actually get a plant to fail that's got a good root system. Most plants fail in their pot rather than above ground. That's the bit to look after. Make sure you repot at the right time when you can see those new roots coming. And often, certainly with Cattleyas, those new roots might not be accompanying a new growth. The new growth might have happened 6 months earlier, and then suddenly it just starts to push those roots out. And on that note, another little discussion that came up, backed up by quite a few people. The unifoliate type Cattleyas with the single leaf pseudobulbs are not so fussy when their repot takes place. The bifoliates are. They are the ones that will lose their root system easier than any others. And they have a narrow window when those new roots are pushing out. So if you need a repot on a bifoliate, get that timing right or you'll stall your plant. Why? Don't ask me, because I don't know. And the other people I asked weren't sure why. It's just their years of experience have said that's how they are. Like it or lump it, the bifoliates are more sensitive to root disturbance. So get that timing right and push your plant on, basically, rather than stall it. So, yep, that'll do. And I'll see you next time. Let's have a last look at that Tolumnia. No sun on it today, but it still shines sunshine colours, even in this dull morning light. It's still little tiny plant, quite small blooms, and yet it lights the place. Oh, just as I say that, the sun's trying to come out. That, to me, lights up my grow room. Those colours, as does this. This Cattleya has just got lovely combination of colours. New acquisition, I can't tell how well that one's doing. All I can say is that its two new growths have bloomed. That could be good. It could be the type of plant that should have had 3 or 4 new growths, and it's not doing so good. But I don't know that yet. I haven't had it long enough. But next year, I'll be able to compare it back to this year when it was a new plant. Then we can see how well it's doing. Right, I will see you next time. And I'm holding my breath. I don't know about you lot. I just hope this is not going to be a disappointment after all this. I know the bloom is attractive. It's an unusual shape. It's very, very fragrant, but to get that fragrance, I've got to get the bloom to last longer than 24 hours. I'll do what I can, but don't worry, it will get filmed. There are some people who have suggested that I'm sleeping in here so that I don't miss it. Well, it's not quite that bad, but it's the first thing I do in the morning after my first coffee is come in here and see what that bud's doing. I really don't want to miss that one. Anyway, I will see you next time. That's probably ended up being a long video when it wasn't intended to be, but yeah, just general chit chat. Bye for now.